Wow.
Pointed out how went there, was instruments of actually was there for reinternment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So powerful.
It is.
They were one day.
Yeah, I've been to those. Yeah.
Point out, and they look at Sudan and they say, but that's not genocide.
It's incredible, isn't it?
I was actually in the UN Human Rights Commission with our ambassador,
Yeah.
when we get the international community can call it genocide, just because it is, as you say, has no definition. Kofi had loved it. What's it mean?
Yeah.
There's a phrase.
Yeah. And they don't understand the impact of that powerful word. Because the one place we're way ahead of Darfur is we're already
The committee will come to order, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for being here. Each day, our newspapers, magazines, radios, and television screens are filled to overflowing with images of people fleeing territory controlled by the Islamic jihadist group known as ISIS. More than half of the 653,000 refugees, an estimated 53% in Europe, are from Syria alone, according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. While violence plays the major part in the impetus of Syrians to leave their homes, Shelley Petterman of the UNHCR testified at a hearing I chaired on October 20th that the main trigger for the flight from refugee camps or shelter in nations like Jordan is the humanitarian funding shortfall. In recent months, he told us that the World Food Program cut its program by 30%, and the current Syrian Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan for 2015 is only 41% funded. The UNHCR expects to receive just 47% of the funding it needs for Syria over the next year. 1 year ago this month, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs issued a report that detailed the worsening humanitarian situation in Syria. An estimated 12.21 million people were in need of humanitarian assistance, including 7.6 million IDPs, or internally displaced people, and more than 5.6 million children in need of assistance. An estimated 4.8 million people were in need of humanitarian assistance in hard-to-reach areas and locations. Those numbers definitely have not improved as the conflict has continued and worsened. By the third International Pledging Conference on March 31st of 2015, the crisis had become the largest displacement crisis in the world, with 3.8 million people having fled to Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and Egypt, in addition to those internally displaced. In support of the Syria Response Plan and Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan, international donors pledged $3.68 billion in money. However, according to the Financial Tracking Service at the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, only 1.17 of the 2.89 billion has been received by December 7th. That constitutes only about 41% of what was considered necessary by that agency. Today's hearing will focus on the plight of persecuted minorities, religious minorities in Syria and in Iraq, which today constitutes genocide, and the failure of much of the international community to live up to their pledges of humanitarian assistance, factors which push refugees to Europe and beyond. In particular, we will examine violence targeting religious minorities such as Christians and Yazidis in territory controlled by ISIS in both Syria and Iraq. This past September, the Simon Skote Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum undertook a, quote, bearing witness trip to northern Iraq to investigate allegations of genocide being committed by ISIS. Their report is chilling. Our generation is gone, the Islamic State's targeting of Iraqi minorities in Nineveh. And in it, they talk about severe deprivation, rape, sexual slavery, enslavement of many kinds, and murder perpetrated in a widespread and systematic manner that indicates a deliberate plan to target religious and ethnic minorities. Mira Ismail, chairman and founder of the Yazidi Human Rights Organization International, will testify today that the Yazidis are on the verge of annihilation. Chaldean Bishop Francis Kalabat will testify that, quote, there are countless Christian villages in Syria who have been taken over by ISIS and have encountered genocide, and the Obama administration refuses to recognize their plight. Carl Anderson, Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus, calls on the Obama administration to publicly acknowledge that genocide is taking place against the Christian communities of Iraq and Syria. Mr. Anderson will testify that, quote, vulnerable religious minorities fear taking shelter in the camps of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees because of religiously motivated violence and intimidation inside the camps. Syrian Christians, he notes, and other vulnerable minorities are disproportionately excluded from the U.S. Syrian Refugee Resettlement Program due to reliance on a functionally discriminatory UNHCR program. So that's where the mistake is initially made, and systematically Christians are excluded. Dr. Gregory Statton, president of Genocide Watch and research professor at George Mason University, in his testimony entitled "Weak Words Are Not Enough," states, failure to call ISIS mass murder of Christians, Muslims, and other groups, in addition to Yazidis, by its proper name, genocide, would be an act of denial as grave as U.S. refusal to recognize the Rwandan genocide in 1994. And I would note parenthetically, I was in Congress in 1994. I was at the UN Commission for Human Rights in Geneva and worked side by side with those in the administration at that time, and there were some who demanded that the Rwandan genocide be called what it was, and there was a refusal. The same thing happened in Bosnia, and it happened elsewhere, and that terrible experience now replays itself over and over again, and it's replaying now. Ethnic cleansing, what does that mean, as Dr. Stanton says in his testimony? The administration reportedly is considering declaring the ISIS mistreatment of Yazidis to be genocide. Frankly, that's good. I encourage that. But there is no indication that Christians will be included. That's absurd and unconscionable. Such an action would be contrary to the facts and tragically wrong. Last year, the UN resolution determined that both Yazidis and Christians were being particularly targeted by ISIS. A group of Christian leaders last week wrote to Secretary of State John Kerry to present their case for treating Christians the same as Yazidis in this matter, but they have not yet received a reply, and hopefully it'll be a positive one. As we attempt to end the ISIS threat, we must consider how to help ensure religious pluralism in Syria and Iraq in the future, and that will not be an easy task, since animosities have grown during the conflicts in Iraq and Syria exponentially. So during the rise as and the reign of terror of ISIS. Nevertheless, unless we consider how to make these lands safe for religious minorities, we will continue to see them chased out of their traditional areas, even if there is no ISIS. Our witnesses today will provide us a picture of the ongoing struggle, provide us hopefully with some recommendations that can be acted upon, being faced by these religious minorities, and hopefully they will help us to begin to make this issue more prominent, and that the designation of a Christian genocide will be declared. I would again note parenthetically, several years ago I chaired a hearing, and I had several since, on the plight of Christians. And we had a representative from the administration who, when instance after instance was detailed by the other witnesses, he said over and over again, and I don't want to embarrass him, but he said over and again, let me take that back and take a look at that, as if there was a lack of awareness about the gravity of people being beheaded and told you either change your religion on the spot here or you will be slaughtered. In like manner, we had a witness that I met in an IDP camp in Jos, Nigeria. That man actually had a Boko Haram terrorist put an AK-47 to his cheek on the ground and said, you renounce your faith as a Christian or I'm going to blow your brains out. He said, I'm ready to meet my Lord. His wife was pleading and sobbing. They pulled the trigger, or he pulled the trigger, the Boko Haram terrorist, blew half his face away, and when he testified, and you'll recall, you could have heard a pin drop here. He had nothing but love and compassion for his oppressor, and he was the one, and thank God he survived, to tell that story. We need to promote, first recognize what's actually going on, call it what it is. We didn't do it in Rwanda. We haven't done it in other places, and do it now. Ms. Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, always for your leadership on these issues. And as you mentioned, the plight of Christians, both men and women, I did want to focus for a bit on the situation faced by women. We read, see, and so much hear about the unspeakable indignities, persecutions faced daily in the region by women. I would be remiss if I didn't raise the situation, especially in war-torn Syria and destabilized pockets in the immediate region, and I commend the efforts of the UN World Population Fund to address the needs of this critical minority. Thousands of women live in fear every day and night. I am talking about the everyday indignities faced by mothers unsure of how they will feed their children on any given day, or a new mother facing hard choices on how to best ensure her infant child and her other children stay in an unsafe battle zone that they know or risk the unknown by moving to another safer region. These are just some of the real stories I have read and heard from the UN Population Fund about their critical work in Syria and the region, addressing the needs of women and girls in the region, whether they be from a religious and or cultural minority or from the majority Muslim population. I'm proud to say that the U.S. supports the work of the UN in both Syria and the region. Women such as an unnamed 26-year-old woman who was kidnapped, sold, and sexually abused for 9 months in northern Iraq, who escaped and found shelter at one of the internally displaced camps. She was severely hurt, physically, emotionally, and mentally. She spent her first days in the camp depressed and helpless before she learned about the UN Population Fund supported women at the Women's Support Center through outreach mobilizers. The social workers at the Women's Support Center immediately offered counseling and healing sessions. Her condition improved noticeably, and eventually she was enrolled in training to upgrade her skills in sewing. She not only completed the courses successfully, but also was promoted to become a trainer. She is now leading classes for other women and girls, including survivors. From the UN Population Fund Regional Situation Report for Syria Crisis for the last month alone, they delivered 298,000 services to Syrians affected by the conflict. So although we don't have women on the panel today, I am hoping that the representatives here will include the plight of women in their testimony. Thank you very much, and I
Thank you very much.
yield back.
I yield to Dana Rohrabacher, Chairman of the Europe, Eurasia, and Emerging Threats Committee.
I would like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and your ranking member for this hearing today. American people need to understand the magnitude of the crime that's going on today in the Middle East and is spreading in different parts of the world. We felt it in San Bernardino in my state just a few days ago. There is a slaughter of innocent people. And in this slaughter that there seems to be not just random or just not just a rage that's being experienced at a moment where someone kills someone else, but it is a well thought out effort to terrorize the world. And we need the good people of the world of every faith, Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Hindus, and the rest need to, the good people of the world need to stand together on this. And I have a piece of legislation that is aimed specifically at those people who have been targeted for genocide and publicly targeted, meaning the Christians and the Yazidis have been actually singled out for being eliminated from the planet. And my bill would just say that it's 4017, that if Christians and Yazidis are trying to come to the United States through the regular refugee and immigration procedures, we should recognize, just like we should have recognized that the Jews were a special case in 1939, instead of sending them back saying, you're not going to get any special treatment from us. Well, we need to give those people who actually are targeted for genocide, as has been announced, a special, basically a priority status of those who are trying to come to the United States. But the American people need to know what's going on. The people of the world need to know. The United States also can't carry this. One last idea, and I'll be interested to hear the points of view of our colleagues today and our people who come here to give us testimony, and that is the United States. Yes. What about recommending that other people start bringing in Christian and Yazidis refugees? For example, Russia has introduced very powerful weapon systems to that region. And if they could do that, I would call on the people of Russia and the government of Russia to bring in Christian refugees from Syria and elsewhere where Christians are being murdered for their faith. Let's see not only military action, but let's see some humanitarian action on the part of Mr. Putin's Russia. So with that said, I'm looking forward to the testimony.
Chairman Rohrabacher, thank you very much. I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel, beginning first with Dr. Gregory Stanton, who is the president of Genocide Watch and the research professor in genocide studies and prevention at the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution of George Mason University in Virginia. Dr. Stanton founded Genocide Watch in 1999, was the founder and director of the Cambodian Genocide Project, and is founder and chair of the International Campaign to End Genocide, the world's first anti-genocide coalition. From 2007 to 2009, he was president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. Dr. Stanton previously served in the U.S. Department of State, where he drafted the UN Security Council's resolutions that created the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the Burundi Commission of Inquiry, and the Central African Arms Flow Commission. We'll then hear from Bishop Francis Calabat, heads the Chaldean Eparchy of St. Thomas the Apostle in Detroit. It is made up of 12 parishes serving a Chaldean Catholic population of approximately 200,000 people. There are a large number of diaspora Iraqi Christians who stay in touch with and support the Chaldean Church in Iraq proper, and more than half of those remaining, approximately 250,000 faithful, have sought refuge from the ravages of ISIS in Kurdish Iraq, home of the Chaldean Archdiocese of Ibril, the Kurdish capital. We'll then hear from Mr. Mirza Ismail, who was chairman of the Yazidi Human Rights Organization International in Ontario, Canada, which he founded in 2009 to protect the rights of the Yazidi people worldwide. This organization has worked with the government of Canada to attain refugee status for Iraqi Yazidis there. Prior to founding that organization, he was chairman and co-founder of London Yazidi Community / Canada. He has written and given interviews extensively on the plight of Yazidis in Iraq. He is from Iraq himself, but now lives in the United States. We'll then hear from Carl Anderson, who is the Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus, where he is Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Board of the world's largest Catholic family fraternal service organization, which has over 1.9 million members. Mr. Anderson has had a distinguished career as a public servant and educator. He's worked in various positions of the Executive Office of the President of the United States, including Special Assistant to the President and Acting Director of the White House Office of Public Liaison. He worked on the Senate side as a key staffer there, and also as a member for nearly a decade for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And then we'll hear from Mr. Noah Gottschalk, I hope I get that right, who is the Senior Policy Advisor for Humanitarian Response at Oxfam America, where he focuses on Syria, Iraq, Sudan, South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as well as broader conflict, and human rights issues. He has more than a decade of experience working with children, families, and communities affected by conflict in these countries and elsewhere in the Middle East and in Africa. He specializes in gender issues and forced displacement, and in the return and reintegration of refugees and internally displaced persons. He traveled on Oxfam's Syria policy lead in mid-2013 and travels regularly to Jordan and to Lebanon as part of Oxfam's work with refugees from Syria and host communities. Dr. Stanton, the floor is yours.
Chairman Smith and Ms. Bass and Mr. Rohrbacher, who Jack Wheeler introduced me to at a party many, many years ago. It's an honor to testify before this subcommittee that's always been a champion of U.S. leadership in global human rights. Soon the State Department is likely to recognize the Yazidi genocide, based not only on an excellent U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum report, but also on the many news reports that show ISIS as unquestionably committing genocide against the Yazidis. But also the State Department is debating whether to also state that ISIS is committing genocide against Christians, Shia Muslims, Sabaya Mandaeans, Turkoman, Kakai, and other religious groups. Genocide Watch said in 2014 that ISIS is committing genocide against all these groups and warned many policymakers about that. Since then, thousands more Yazidis, Christians, Shia Muslims, and others have been murdered. Such acts of genocide are strong proof of ISIS' intent to destroy in whole or in part these religious and ethnic groups. Why is it important to use the word genocide? Some people say, well, we can just call them crimes against humanity, and after all, the penalties are the same in the International Criminal Court, pretty much. So what difference does it make? Well, some epidemiologists and I actually did a study of this in 2007. We counted up the number of times the words genocide and ethnic cleansing, which was at that time very popular, were used in 4 genocides. In the case of Rwanda, in the case of Bosnia, case of Kosovo, and then of Darfur. What we discovered in every single case is, as long as it was called ethnic cleansing, no action was taken. When genocide became the word that described the crime, then action would be taken. And in fact, in the report that I've submitted to you, I have actually got the dates exact about when the term genocide began to be used and when our action began. And it is striking what a difference that word makes. Now, the reason why it is so powerful is that, and that is why Raphael Lemkin invented the word, is that genocide actually means the destruction of a people, of a nation, of a whole group of people. And it may not be the whole group, it can be a part of the group. That's often forgotten. But it therefore impoverishes the entire human race. Not just, it's not just a crime like some of the other crimes of humanity. This is a crime against the entire future of the human race when you try to eliminate a people. Now, fortunately, in this case, the U.S. is already taking forceful action to defeat ISIS, as we should. And I only just want to make an argument that we have adequate proof already of the intent to commit genocide by ISIS against Christians and against Shia Muslims. The evidence against of ISIS genocide against Christians is put into question in the Holocaust Museum's report by the fact that they accepted the ISIS propaganda that Christians can pay a jizya tax and thereby be spared from being killed. Well, it's an ISIS lie. The truth is the ISIS tax is so high that few can pay it, and so they're beheaded, or even more likely, crucified, if they will not renounce their faith in Jesus Christ and convert to Islam. So I would argue very strongly that all of these groups already have plenty of evidence of the intent to destroy their group in part, and they should be included in the finding of the State Department. There are 2 especially important reasons why the State Department should declare that these groups are targets of genocide. First of all, as Congressman Rohrabacher has suggested, the term genocide makes members of such groups much more likely to receive the preferential treatment as bona fide refugees that they should receive under the UN Convention and Protocols on the Status of Refugees, to which the U.S. is a state party, and also under the refugee laws of the United States. It will be a huge help to Christians to be able to be recognized as people having a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of their religious faith. And the second reason is that the word genocide more strongly justifies our broad coalition for military support for Kurdish and Iraqi forces to defeat ISIS, and would you believe it, in this case also to even join with another country that would defend Christians as Congressman Rohrabacher has suggested, namely Russia. It justifies also our arming and training militias of these targeted groups for self-defense, which is always the best defense against genocide. So we commend the Congresspeople who have introduced HCON Resolution 75, which declares that genocide is being committed against these groups. We commend the Congresspeople who have introduced HRes 447 that is specifically aimed at the plight of women that Congressman Bass has particularly pointed out, because women are treated as sex slaves by the ISIS group. It's a whole system of sex slavery. And we also commend Congressman Rohrabacher for his bill 4017. Thank you very much.
Dr. Stanton saying thank you very much. Bishop?
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Bass, as well as the other distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you very much for having us here before you today. This hearing couldn't come at a more critical time, as it elevates the responsibility to protect the most vulnerable ethno-religious populations in Iraq and in Syria. I'd like to mention, when I mention Christians, it will include Chaldeans, Assyrians, Syriac-based Christians, who to this day still speak the Aramaic language, the language of Jesus Christ, and uphold an ancient culture and identity. This, as we speak, is under threat of extinction in that region. Iraq and Syria's Christians are part of the original inhabitants of ancient Mesopotamia, cradle of civilization, who played a crucial role in the advancement of the sciences and philosophies of the region, and even had a great influence on the West. Since the fall of Mosul in early June 2014, Christians have endured targeted persecution in the form of forced displacement, sexual violence, other human rights violations. All 45 churches and monasteries around Mosul fell to the hands of ISIS, which subsequently removed the buildings, crosses, burned, looted, and destroyed much of these properties. By late July, the last of the Christians in Mosul escaped the city following an edict issued by ISIS offering minorities the option to either convert to Islam, pay a tax, flee, or to be killed, leading to a modern-day genocide. Before Iraq, ISIS had committed horrible genocidal atrocities against the Christians in Syria. Although I represent and will speak about the Christians, ISIS has committed horrific atrocities against the Yazidis, of which my fellow brother sitting next to me will be talking in more detail about, and other sects, including Muslims themselves, but I'm here to represent the Christians. It's important to recognize that the atrocities in Iraq began as early as 2005. This preceded ISIS. Christians and other minorities in Iraq have experienced their own slow and perpetual genocide. I wish to note that the Obama administration, including President Obama himself, have neglected to mention that the ISIS atrocities were committed against Christians. Time and time again, they rightly mention atrocities committed in Iraq against the Yazidis, absolutely, and they are horrific. But there are also atrocities of rape and killings and crucifixions of Christians, beheadings, hangings that the Syrian and Iraqi Christians have endured, and they are intentionally omitted. I hate to say this, but this they do to their own shame. There are more than 150,000 Iraqi Christians who are now displaced in northern Iraq, or are refugees in other countries, such as approximately 35,000 refugees in Jordan, 60,000 refugees in Lebanon, 30,000 in Turkey, who are being victimized, and I hate to say this, by the Obama administration and not recognizing their suffering. There are countless Christian villages in Syria who have been taken over by ISIS and have encountered genocide, and the Obama administration again refuses to recognize their plight. And again, I say, shame on you. Speaking of these refugees, I do want to take the opportunity to recognize Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. They've been overwhelmed by these refugees, and yet they have never closed their doors. And they're not only the Christian refugees, the Muslim refugees, the Yazidi refugees, all other minorities as well. They have never closed their doors. And especially I want to recognize Turkey, who went out of their way to grant them free medical needs, free education, countless other opportunities by an act of parliament. That's huge on the country, to all Iraqi refugees. But this also brings me to a very sensitive issue. Should these refugees be brought to the United States? And if so, should we differentiate between Muslim, Christian, or Yazidi refugees? In my mind, it shouldn't be an issue, because the other Middle Eastern countries should have stepped up as well. Why is it only the West, other than the three countries that I mentioned? Here's my point. Where's the best place for a Muslim Syrian refugee to settle? Kuwait or Germany? Saudi Arabia or Canada? Qatar or America? My point, it's much easier for an Arab refugee to start over in a country where the language is the same, culture is similar, and the official religion of that country is the same. Of course, there's always that identifying differentiation between the Sunni and the Shiite. Where's the best place for a Yazidi or a Christian refugee? What ISIS was able to do is the Christian does not feel safe, neither does the Yazidi in his own country. Targeting of the Christian for rape, loss of property, killings, etc., as well as the Yazidi, has caused a loss of trust. Christians have not been part of any terrorist activity, but instead have been the targets of terrorist activities. And now they are being looked at as possible terrorists when they are also lumped and they're told that you can't come to any of these, and at least to the United States. This is simply unfair on top of everything that they have gone through. Go back, but shouldn't be the same for Muslim anywhere in the in the Middle East. I ask, where's Kuwait in all of this? Where's Saudi Arabia? Where's Qatar? Where's Bahrain? Where Arabs pride themselves on what is called Arab hospitality, which includes the proper treatment of those who are needy. What happened to welcoming them as guests and sharing with them their needs? The Muslim faith is very clear about this as well. Where are they? I speak this to their shame as well. Does this mean that no Muslim, Syrian, or Iraqi refugee should enter a Western country? No, absolutely not. Not at all. I merely am saying that it would be a much easier task, and I believe many, if given the opportunity, would prefer to remain in a safe Middle Eastern country than go to Sweden and feel lost. Do I say all? No. But today, it's not even an option. And again, I say this to their shame, who've lost their Arab dignity and Muslim faith. The reason is these refugees are seen as surplus, undignified, excess trash. They don't want them in their countries. Possible solutions. First, U.S. government needs to continue to work with United Nations and other churches, charities, private corporations. We need to find aid. The numbers that were mentioned by Chairman Chris Smith are beyond understanding, especially in places like Syria. I mean, the basic needs of these human beings are not being met. Second, the U.S. government should not turn a blind eye to the genocidal atrocities. Proclaim it for what it is. If it's not, then it's not. If it is, then it is. Truth will set you free, a famous man once said. Autonomous regions for Christians is the third possibility. They need safety. If we want them to live in safety, we need to provide it for them. Short of a genuine solution, Christians and other ethno-religious minorities of Nineveh will become extinct. Thank you for your time.
Bishop, thank you so very much for your very powerful words, your recommendations, and then your bottom line, extinction. This is an existential threat, if ever there was one, and you have made your case very powerfully. Mr. Ishmael, the floor is yours, and I understand you do have some photographs you'd like to show, and I would say with all respect to this reality, just like the Holocaust and so many other atrocities committed by mankind over the centuries, I think it's important that people see what we're actually talking about. So if somebody might be offended, please don't look at the monitor.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
we only have about 10 minutes or less than 10 minutes for today. And I'd certainly like to hear it carefully and see the pictures.
Okay. Okay. Then I think my friend and colleague makes a very good point. Rather than rush, we stand in brief recess. There are 2 votes. Hopefully within about 15 or 20 minutes we'll be back. But thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
We stand in recess. The subcommittee will resume its sitting, and we've been joined by two distinguished members. Dr. DeJarle, who's a member of our subcommittee, and any comments he might want to make or wait until. And Trent Franks, who actually is the head of the Religious Freedom Caucus here in the House of Representatives, and has spoken out unceasingly about the slaughter of Christians in Syria and Iraq. Doctor? Okay. Or Trent?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Chris Smith. I think that he is the most persistent and committed voice for human rights in the United States Congress, and for all the people here on the dais here. And I especially want to appreciate those people who have come here to give voice to those who can't be here, and to those who are either no longer a part of the human family because their lives have been taken from them, or because they just don't have the opportunity to speak to the world like all of you do. And I think it's noble. I think it's seen by God himself, and I think that only eternity will discover your impact or your reward for what you do. I know that it is as much a part of the American ideal as anything, this notion that all human beings bear the imago Dei, the image of God, and therefore their creation and their being part of God's plan for this world holds them up to such a value that it is beyond any of us to articulate that. But I am also so broken that sometimes those of us that live in this thing called human family miss that. And there are those that find themselves in the shadows of the world and of the human experience and never have the opportunity to really be seen for who they are. And I take great comfort in the notion that God sees each one of them. And if time turns every star in heaven to ashes, that eternal moment of his deliverance will finally come to each one of them, whether they were delivered here on this earth or not. But I am grateful that you folks are here today. I think that there are two relevant suggestions that are at least part of my contribution to this effort. And number one is that when we see malevolence and evil desecrate the innocent, it is incumbent upon those of us who are part of the arsenal of freedom to respond and to make sure that it doesn't happen, and to make sure that those who do desecrate the innocent realize that they do so at great risk to themselves, and they can never consider themselves with impunity to this country's commitment to protecting the innocent. And I feel like that in the case of Iraq and ISIS, that responsibility was unconscionably failed and fell so short of what it should have been, even though that there were a lot of voices trying to express the need to respond to this evil before it was able to manifest, as it most certainly did. And then the second thing, when these things do happen, that I believe that the people of the free world have a strong responsibility to make it clear to the world that these innocents did not die in vain, nor did they suffer in vain, nor were they tortured in vain. In other words, that we, in this part of the world, will respond, and we will hold those not only accountable, but we will hold them up to the world in disdain, those that would have desecrated the innocent like they did. And it is important that we don't leave anyone out. Certainly the Yazidis, I met with a number of Yazidis. We had press conferences doing everything we could to bring attention to their plight. And we need to hold that up in the strongest possible way. These are a peaceful people that just desire to live in the light of freedom and try to see their children grow and to lay hold on the miracle of life. It is a very fundamentally reasonable request that they make. And of course, Mr. Chairman, it's important that we don't leave out any of the religious groups, that whether they're Christian, Yazidi, Muslim, whatever they are, that they are part of the human family, and that they should be looked upon as a brother and a sister and as a fellow child of God. And that means that we should not only stand and do everything we can to protect all of them, but we should do everything that we can to point out the fate of them. And when we make resolutions calling for assigning genocide, it should include all of those that were victims. And I say that with the greatest deference and the greatest respect for every last one of them, even those that were especially singled out for some reason other than the other. Those things can be articulated in those resolutions, but we should not leave anyone out, because to do so is to invite that same group to be attacked again. And again, I have no words, Mr. Chairman, to express how deeply I wish that we could have responded better, and how I wish there weren't evil impulses in the world like ISIS. But I will tell you this, truth and time travel on the same road. And the truth is that ISIS is evil, and they will meet an appropriate end. Those that were their victims will find themselves at great advantage in the councils of eternity. So with that, God bless you all, and thank you for coming. And I, again, can't express the level of honor and just goodwill that's in my heart toward each one of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Franks, thank you very much. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Ishmael. The floor is yours.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Smith, committee members, I am honored to be here. Thank you for this opportunity to speak at this hearing on genocide by ISIS and refugee crisis. I also want to thank the Holocaust Memorial Museum for its recent report asserting that the Yazidi are indeed the victim of genocide. The Kildeo-Syrian Christian should have been included in this report. Our loss may not be the same, but the ISIS brutal action against both of us are the same. Ladies and gentlemen, I am here today to speak of preventing the annihilation by ISIS of my people, the Yazidi, and of the Kildeo-Syrian Christian, Mandaean, in Iraq and Syria. We Yazidi are desperate for your immediate help and support. During our 6,000-year history, the Yazidi have faced 74 genocides in the Middle East, including the ongoing genocide. Why? Simply because we are non-Muslims. We are an ancient and proud people from the heart of Mesopotamia, the birthplace of civilization and the birthplace of many of the world's religions. And here we are today, in 2015, on the verge of annihilation. In response to our suffering around the world, there's profound, obscene silence. We Yazidi are considered infidels in the eyes of Muslims. And so they are encouraged to kill, rape, enslave, and convert us. On August 2nd, 2014, on the eve of ISIS attack on the Yazidis in Sinjar region, more than 10,000 of the local authority forces were present in Sinjar region, allegedly there to protect the Yazidi. In the early hours of the evening, the Yazidi tried desperately to flee for their lives to Mount Sinjar, but the local militia would not allow it. At about 10 p.m., these same local forces who had promised to defend us began to withdraw from the Yazidis' villages of the southern side of the Sinjar mountain without notifying the Yazidi. They escaped back to the KRG region. The Yazidi men begged the local forces for weapons and ammunition so that we could defend ourselves from ISIS, but they refused. They would not spare even one weapon, not one round of ammo to the Yazidi men. Women and children whom they, the local militia, had trapped in what was a waiting room for the death and carnage at the hands of ISIS. And several Yazidi who begged and pleaded for weapons to save themselves and their people were killed like dogs by Peshmerga. And so, God help us. On August 3rd, at around 2 a.m., ISIS entered Sinjar region. The stage was set for the massacre of our people. For we possessed only very basic weapons such as AK-47 rifles, the women, children and elderly, and empty-handed adults with no means of self-defense at all, tried to escape the barbarian and flee to Mount Sinjar. It didn't take long, only 4 or 5 hours it took for the poorly armed TSD fighters to run out of ammunition, and region was overrun with death, and ISIS took over Sinjar region. With no means of defense, of course, carnage was immense. Thousands of men were killed on the spot, including beheading of hundreds. The UN estimates that 5,000 Yazidi were murdered and thousands of women and children taken hostage. Then on August 6, 2014, ISIS attacked the Yazidis and killed those Syrian Christians in the Nineveh plain. Resulting genocide took the lives of thousands of Yazidi and Kildor Syrian and Shia minority. ISIS has wiped from existence of the most culturally diverse areas across the Middle East. Today, hundreds of thousands of who are still alive have taken refuge in IDP camps across the Iraqi Kurdish region and some Shia in the southern Iraq. They are urgently require your help. There are thousands of young Yazidi women, girls, and even children who, as I speak, have been enslaved and forced into sexual slavery. These girls are subjected to daily multiple rapes by ISIS monsters. According to many escaped women and girls whom I talked to in northern Iraq, the abducted Yazidi, mostly women and children, number over 7,000. Some of those women and girls have had to watch 7, 8, and 9-year-old children bleed to death before their eyes after being raped by ISIS militia multiple times a day. I met mothers whose children were torn from them by ISIS. These same mothers came to plead for the return of their children, only to be informed that they, the mothers, had been fed the flesh of their own children by ISIS. Children murdered, then fed to their own mothers. ISIS militia have burned many Yazidis alive for refusing to convert and marry ISIS men. Young Yazidi boys are being trained to be jihadists and suicide bombers. All of our temples in the ISIS-controlled area are exploded and destroyed. The entire Yazidi population was displaced in less than 1 day on August 3, 2014 in Sinjar. The Yazidis and Kildor Syrian Christians face this genocide together. Why? Again, because we are non-Muslims, and because our path is the path of peace. For this, we are being burnt alive, for living as men and women of peace. What I have just recounted to you, what has happened to the Yazidi, Kildor Syrian, Sabian, in Sinjar and Nineveh Plain, and other minorities, nothing less than genocide, according to the UN definition of genocide. IDPs and refugee crisis in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. Humanitarian aid, while necessary, is not sufficient. Much humanitarian aid distributed by Kurdish regional authorities and the Iraqi government never gets into the hands of those who need, those for whom it was intended, due to skimming, corruption, and politics. Some outside observers say that as much as 90% of the humanitarian assistance meant for Yazidi and other minorities has never reached their hands. There are more than 30,000 Yazidi refugees currently languishing in Turkey and Syria. At the top of the threatened and persecuted list are the Yazidi. Then come Kildor Syrian, Christian. 5,000 Yazidi were murdered by ISIS in August of 2014, and 7,000 were enslaved, mostly young women and children. Thousands fled to camps where they are abused by the Muslim authority in charge, denied food and medicine because of not being affiliated with their own political parties. Or they cannot get into refugee camps at all, consequently are not certified as refugees, since one cannot get refugee status without being certified, and the Muslims who dominated the camps do not want them there. The same holds true for the Kildwa-Syrian Christian who have repeatedly been forced to renounce their religion or die. Enslavement, rape, hundreds of their churches have been desecrated and destroyed. If humanitarianism is the chief reason being cited in accepting refugees, the Yazidi and Kildwa-Syrian Christian, Mandaean, and other minorities group should receive priority simply because they are among the most persecuted in the Middle East and the ones who have nowhere else to go. Perhaps the worst camp for the Yazidis refugee in Turkey, those that bordered with Syria, because of the fighting between the PKK and the Turkish government. The Yazidi worry about the Russian plane recently downed by the Turkey. In the event of war between the two countries, Yazidi refugees are afraid of being used as human shield. Because of the unsafe situation, hundreds of these Yazidi are fleeing for Europe. They are seeking safety and peaceful life. And yet, hundreds of these refugees have lost their lives on the journey, whether in the freezer of truck trailers or by drowning in their two boats in the sea between Turkey and Greece. Others die of starvation and dehydration, attempting to reach safety by foot. In all cases, their desperation is the cause of death. I am now pleading with each and every one of you, in the name of humanity, to lend us your help and support at this crucial time to save the indigenous and peaceful people of the Middle East, the Yazidi, the Kildwa-Syrian Christian, the Mandaeans, and other minorities. Our demands and solution: recognize the Yazidi Kildwa-Syrian Christian genocide and provide international protection so we can live as God created us. Concerned nations, including the US, Canada, UK, NATO, and EU member states, and the United Nations, should make a concerted effort to liberate the ISIS detention center. As mentioned, we estimate at least 4,000 are currently held, young Yazidi women, girls, and children by ISIS. We ask the United Nations, US, Canada, UK, and NATO, other members of the international community, to intervene with the Iraqi government, supporting the creation of an autonomous region for the Yazidi, Kildwa-Syrian, and other minorities in Sinjar region and Nineveh Plain under the production of international forces and directly tied to Baghdad's central government. This right is guaranteed and under the Iraqi Constitution, Article 125, but it needs implementation. This is the only way we can survive in Middle East. We ask the US and all sympathetic governments around the world to develop refugee policies that can work quickly and effectively to provide new homes for the needy refugee, for the Yazidi, for the Kildwa-Syrian Christian, and other minority who urgently need new beginning, especially the abducted one who were able to escape from ISIS far away from the carnage we witnessed. Germany has agreed to accept 1,000 Yazidi refugees who were abducted by ISIS, and about 700 have arrived already. I hope that the US can do the same and provide social psycho help to those innocent women and girls. Humanitarian aid must be sent immediately to those internally displaced persons in northern Iraq. There is an imminent threat of starvation, dehydration, and diseases, especially for the Yazidis in Mount Sinjar. As much as possible, This assistance should come from neutral, non-governmental sources to mitigate diversion of food and water. Thank you so much for listening and for the very careful consideration going forward. We beseech you with the greatest urgency to help save the remnants of our nation, of the Kildor Syrian, of Mandaeans and other minorities. Only with your help, after you have experienced so much death and suffering, is there a possible of a peaceful life going forward for our people. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much for that very powerful testimony. We're joined by Mark Meadows, Vice Chairman of the committee. Any comments now? Okay. We'll go to Mr. Anderson now.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for this hearing, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee and discuss the Knights of Columbus humanitarian aid programs. Over the past year, our programs have helped to feed, heal, shelter, and educate many thousands of desperate Christians in church-run camps or other private places of refuge in Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. We've established a donation and a news web portal titled ChristiansAtRisk.org and have to date donated over $5 million in direct aid to Christians and other persecuted minorities in the region. And we've partnered with other organizations such as Catholic Relief Services, Aid to the Church in Need, Caritas, and local dioceses in Iraq and Syria. Our assistance has taken many forms in terms of food, shelter, education, and medical assistance. At times, we have been required to give exceptional care. For example, just several weeks ago, we helped Katrina, a very sick 15-year-old Iraqi girl, by organizing her airlift from a displaced persons camp in Erbil. Her life was saved when she was brought to New England, a New England hospital for treatment for numerous issues that she could not adequately be treated for in Iraq. We also are funding the work of a medical clinic in the Kurdistan Authority, which is the first point of contact for many Yazidi women who are escaping from conditions of sexual slavery there. Through this humanitarian work in the Middle East, we have made 3 basic observations and 4 recommendations bearing on U.S. human rights and refugee policy that I would like to focus on in my testimony today. And in the interest of time, I'll just briefly summarize them. The Christian communities of Iraq and Syria, along with those of other vulnerable religious minorities, are suffering genocide that continues to the present time. We recommend, therefore, that the Congress swiftly adopt House Concurrent Resolution 75, which names and decries the ongoing genocide against Christians and other vulnerable minorities in Iraq and Syria. Further, we recommend that the United States State Department publicly acknowledge that genocide is taking place against the Christian communities of Iraq and Syria, including in its reportedly impending statement on genocide that, according to reports, refers properly but only to Nineveh's Yazidi community. The United States is rightly viewed, Mr. Chairman, as the world's leading defender of vulnerable minorities, and it is critically important that our State Department consider the best available evidence before issuing a statement that would exclude Christians. An official government declaration of genocide is an opportunity to bring America's religious communities together to pursue the truth, to support victims, and to bear witness to the noble principle of never again. Last week, the Knights of Columbus sent an urgent letter to Secretary of State John Kerry asking for an opportunity to brief him about this genocide. This letter was signed by Cardinal Donald Wuerl, the Archbishop of Washington, and more than 24 other religious leaders and scholars from across the political spectrum and from diverse Orthodox, Protestant, Mormon, as well as Catholic faith traditions. And a copy of the letter was submitted with my testimony as an addendum. Third, the Christian communities of Iraq and Syria, along with those other vulnerable religious minorities, fear taking shelter in the camps of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees because of religiously motivated violence and intimidation that occurs inside the camps. We recommend, therefore, that the United States insist on proper security inside the camps, and that we identify ways to ensure that Christians and other vulnerable minorities from Iraq and Syria are not subject to violence inside the UNHCR facilities, including the possibility of providing separate facilities for minorities and hiring professional staff that would include members of the minority communities. The U.S. should require the UNHCR to gather and make public, along with its other data, the religious affiliation of all the refugees it serves. To ignore reports of humanitarian problems without prompt investigation and corrective action is itself an injustice. We've had aid organizations at the camps in Jordan, for example, Zatari and Azraq, where there's 100,000 Syrian refugees unable to find a single Christian in those camps. Our fourth recommendation, Syrian Christians and other vulnerable minorities are disproportionately excluded from the U.S. Syrian Refugee Resettlement Program due to a reliance on what has become a functionally discriminatory UNHCR program. So we recommend that the U.S. government take immediate action to implement its stated policy of prioritizing the resettlement of vulnerable minorities, including Christians. In addition, we recommend that the U.S. government end its sole reliance on the UNHCR for refugee referrals and engage private contractors to identify, document, and refer Christian, Yazidi, and other vulnerable minority refugees from Syria and Iraq who are in need of resettlement. In conclusion, permit me to observe that the near complete dependency of these refugees on our help and that of other private charities to meet their essential needs will continue for the foreseeable future. Therefore, the policy recommendations we've mentioned just now are urgently necessary. And it should be noted, obviously, that the Christian communities and other vulnerable minorities have not taken up arms on any side of the violence. They have been peaceful. Finally, let me just mention again, Pope Francis has been in the forefront in calling attention to this ongoing crisis, especially here during his visit to the United States. He has said what is happening to these Christians and other religious minorities is a form of genocide and it must end. And finally, if you permit me one final request in closing, I would ask you to consider special funding to investigate and obtain documentation and evidence of the crime of genocide that is occurring in Syria and Iraq. We need to investigate, preserve that evidence now before it disappears if we are going to move forward seriously on the issue of genocide in this region. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. And our final, Mr. Gatchok.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the subcommittee, it is an honor to be here today to testify on the humanitarian situation in Syria and Iraq, and on what we can do to better assist victims of the ongoing conflict in both countries. My testimony is drawn from several months spent over the last few years speaking to civilians caught up in these conflicts, as well as from the ongoing work of my Oxfam colleagues in Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, where they are on the ground providing aid to nearly 1.7 million people. In my testimony today, I will highlight some of the humanitarian challenges facing the people of Syria and Iraq, and what the U.S. can do to better assist them. Oxfam is calling for urgent and immediate action by the U.S. and the international community to deal with this deepening crisis. First, by fully funding the aid response in Syria, Iraq, and the region. Second, by ensuring humanitarian access to those in need of aid and offering refuge to those who have fled their country. And third, by reviving concerted efforts towards a resolution of these crises. The statistics in Syria paint a deeply grim picture. I've included more detail in my written statement, but it is worth highlighting here that indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks are being committed by all parties to the conflict, including through the use of barrel bombs, mortar attacks, and other explosive weapons in populated areas. These types of attacks remain by far the primary cause of civilian deaths and injuries. Well over half the entire pre-war population of Syria has been forced to flee their homes, making Syria the largest displacement crisis in the world today. As the number of people in need grows, aid from humanitarian agencies, however, is being drastically reduced due to funding shortages. The U.S. remains the largest single donor to the Syria humanitarian crisis, providing more than $4.5 billion since the start. Yet according to Oxfam's analysis, the U.S. is still not meeting its fair share of aid to the Syria crisis based on our gross national income. This year, we've reached approximately 72% of our fair share. The U.S. must continue to lead by example and encourage our allies to follow suit. And I'll note that I've included in my written testimony some of the specifics of other countries and what percentages of their fair share that they've met for comparison. In Iraq, the U.S. is also the leading donor, having provided over $500,000 to the humanitarian response over the last two fiscal years. However, as in Syria, the scale of need is far outpacing aid contributions, with Iraq's humanitarian appeal only about 2/3 funded. The UN now estimates that 11 million Iraqis will require some form of humanitarian assistance in 2016. The humanitarian crisis in Iraq is a protection crisis above all else. Today, on the second to last day of the 16 days of action against gender violence, we must remember the 1.4 million Iraqi women remain displaced. And while it is an honor to be testifying here among such distinguished witnesses, I do think it is unfortunate that no women are testifying today, particularly to speak on the impact of the conflict on women and girls. As we have seen in our work on the ground, gender-based violence is one of the most significant features of this crisis and has a major impact on the ability of women and girls in particular to recover from trauma of conflict. The challenges for the people of Syria and Iraq extend beyond funding shortages. Inside both countries, insufficient international aid contributions are compounded by the difficulties that far too many civilians have in accessing the assistance that is present. In Syria, shifting conflict lines, the rise of extremist groups such as ISIS, and restrictions imposed by the government on aid agencies have impeded humanitarian access. Indeed, as Chairman Smith recognized at the start, the United Nations estimates now that more than 4.8 million people in Syria in need of humanitarian assistance are in hard-to-reach and besieged locations. In Iraq, the ability of people to flee to safety is a major problem. On my last visit to the country earlier this year, I stood on the side of the road with a group of several hundred Iraqi children, women, and men who'd been forced to flee their homes in Ramadi. Horrified by the brutality they'd witnessed, frightened for their friends and neighbors from Christian and other minority communities, and terrified that they themselves would be swept up in the violence, they were now trying to find safety, first in Baghdad, where they were rejected, and then in the north of their country. One man spoke of his brother being killed and his barbershop being burned to the ground. Now, with his children and wife in tow, he was trying to find refuge with his family in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, where he'd grown up and studied. But because he's a Sunni Muslim, the authorities were not allowing him and many others to enter the region for fear that he might be associated with the very extremists who attacked his family and destroyed his livelihood. Without clear guarantees of safety and enhanced humanitarian space, Iraqi families like his will have little option but to turn back to areas held by the same extremists they seek to escape. No humanitarian efforts, however well-intentioned, can take the place of an end to conflicts. In Syria, far too many powers are fueling conflict rather than undertaking earnest efforts to bring it to an end. In Iraq, any efforts to restore stability and return populations must be accompanied by the provision of genuine physical protection to all at-risk communities. Now, this includes Sunni Arab populations in areas currently occupied by ISIS, or communities who have fled violence and face risk of reprisal killings, threats to safety, and further displacement. While the persecution of minorities has been the most visible and systemic on all sides of the conflict, civilians have been targeted on the basis of group identity: Yazidis, Christians, Turkmen, and even Sunni Arabs. Iraq's social fabric has been torn apart. In attempting to help put it back together, we must make sure that we do not inadvertently stigmatize communities which still consider themselves first and foremost Iraqi. A lasting political solution in both countries will enable the return and reintegration of the displaced, but this will require a meaningful process of reconciliation and genuine safety for all of Syria's and Iraq's citizens. Finally, no discussion of the ways to assist Syrian and Iraqis would be complete without reference to refugee resettlement. Although it will ultimately benefit just a tiny fraction of Syrian and Iraqi refugees, America's well-established, secure, and successful resettlement program is literally a life and death matter for persecuted women, men, and children who have no other means of survival. It is also a fundamental expression of our values as Americans to offer safe haven to the persecuted and allows us to show the suffering and oppressed around the world the best of who we are as a people. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I would just point out that we had planned on Yazidi women testifying today, and they couldn't get their visas in time. This has not been the first hearing that I've chaired on this. It won't be the last. Matter of fact, we will have the administration or request that they come and provide an accounting. Hopefully it'll be a positive one where they have indeed declared that Christians and other minority faiths have been designated the subject of genocide. Yes, the Yazidis, absolutely, but also these others. And we will hold the administration to account. When I got word of this about 3 weeks ago myself from someone inside the State Department, I immediately put out a press release and a statement and tried to contact folks there to convey my utter disbelief that this egregious abandonment was about to happen. And it was, as Dr. Stanton pointed out, eerily reminiscent to what happened in Rwanda when there was this foolishness of the greatest degree, an unwillingness to call what was happening, 800,000 plus dead in Rwanda, a genocide, and we saw similar actions by the international community, including the United States, occur. It was so bad that when Kofi Annan went to Rwanda, members of their parliament stood up and turned their backs on him, and a similar sense of disgust also was leveled against Bill Clinton. And as you point out, Dr. Stanton, we had a hearing on the famous facts where Kofi Annan was advised that the genocide was about to occur. He ignored it. He was head of peacekeeping at the time, and General Dallaire suffered immensely emotionally because he probably could have mitigated, if not ended that completely. So just for the record, I would like to include in the record a very heartbreaking but a story, Steadfastness unto Death, Christians martyred by the Islamic State, that just came out in December 12th issue of World magazine. They have named these unbelievably brave Christians, faithful to the end, as their Daniels of the year. So without objection, that will be made a part of the record. Just a few questions, because your testimonies were brilliant. I believe it really laid out and anticipated much of what I and perhaps others might have asked. But again, Obama and the administration seem to be on the verge of getting it wrong. I think the letter that you will provide as an addendum as part of your testimony, Mr. Anderson, laid it out very clearly, and others have done so as well, as to how that would be a mistake of monumental proportions to exclude a group of people who have been targeted for extension. It's not even part, it is whole, and whole or in part, and even the threat of whole or in part is the boilerplate language of the Genocide Convention. So, I mean, this fits that definition, sadly, to a T. The abandonment, perhaps some of you or any of you might want to speak to the why of it. I can't get my arms around this lack of acceptance of reality on the ground that has been documented time and time again. 3 years ago, I introduced a resolution and tried to get the administration, wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post, to create a Syrian war crimes tribunal, to hold all sides to account for atrocities. This was before the emergence of ISIS, September 13th, and put in a resolution that would do the exact same thing. I've asked Secretary Kerry. You know, we know that the International Criminal Court has been very flawed in prosecuting anyone, one conviction in over a dozen years. Great idea, but just doesn't have the horsepower or the capabilities to do what is right. We had the former chief prosecutor of the Sierra Leone War Crimes Tribunal, David Crane, testify, and others who gave riveted testimony why a regional court would make all the difference in the world, and we are losing, as was mentioned, vital information and testimony that bleeds out as people move on or die or don't have the recollection they might have if it's done sooner rather than later. I'm asking again that the administration could work within the United Nations, the Security Council, to convene such a war crimes tribunal. ICC, they haven't done it. They got one person in the DR Congo, a lower level person that they were able to convict. They'll look into it, they'll issue a report, they'll go after 2 people, and that'll be the end of it. And they'll never get those 2 people. Bashir in Khartoum remains in Khartoum despite his crimes in Darfur and South Sudan. So anyone who might want to hazard a guess as to if this is an idea whose time has come, you, Dr. Stanton, kind of indicated that already. Carl Anderson, I think you brought up an issue that just is beguiling and it begs immediate correction, and that is that the UNHCR itself has not been able to provide the protection inside the camps. So a place that ought to be, you know, the place of welcoming becomes a place of continued horror for Christians. I promise we will use this committee to look into that and push that to the nth degree. The administration should be doing the same. And I think your point about sole reliance on referrals from the UNHCR is an excellent point that needs to be embraced immediately because of all this exclusion, again, of the Christians. And, of course, designation of genocide against Christians like Yazidis and other minority faiths will make the processing of their refugee appeals happen that much sooner rather than later. And maybe they might not have happened at all without it. So those couple of thoughts, I can't get my arms around. Maybe you can. Why the exclusion of Christians? It's just, it's mind-boggling. If anybody wants to hazard a guess, otherwise I'll yield to my distinguished colleagues.
Again, thank you for the leadership. Let me just note that in my 28 years in Congress, whenever there has been an issue that calls for a moral stand by the United States of America, Chris Smith has always led the way, and I've always been honored to follow him as he led the way. And this is, I think, one of those instances of historical significance that demands people of certain moral fortitude to step forward and make their moral convictions known on a major contention of the day. And how many, let me just ask the panel, we're talking about Christians and Yazidis now, and but there are other groups that, as we know, that are facing slaughter. But if we don't do what's right, if we have an administration in charge of our government now that refuses to recognize that Christians are targeted, as the Jews were in World War II, how many people is the world going to lose? How many Christians? Are we talking about millions of people? What is the Christian population of this part of the Middle East, and what can we expect if those people are not given refuge?
About 1.5 million in Iraq alone. Christians were there before the Second Iraq War. We now have, I think, under, about 100,000 or so.
And that's just Iraq.
And that's only, they're in refugees camps in Kurdistan. And that's just Iraq.
Okay. And in Syria and throughout in different places?
Syria, you had 10% of the population is Christian. And they have had to basically flee, wherever they can go, because not only ISIS has targeted them, but of course the Assad regime has bombed so many parts of Syria that they've had to flee to Turkey.
So,
or Jordan.
Do we have some guesses in terms of, or I say educated guesses? We're talking about over a million,
yes,
a million people dead unless we step forward. Is that maybe 2 million people dead?
Possible.
It's also very important to understand that ISIS isn't just targeting people in that region. Their ultimate aim is United States, Vatican, Europe. It's the world. And so they're not, in establishing an Islamic State right now, that Islamic State needs to grow, and it needs to, until they can rule the world. And so this isn't just an isolated group.
So we're talking about the short term. There's maybe 1 million or 2 million people who are in danger right now. But what you're saying is, unless we step up to this part of the challenge,
Thank you.
there's
Paris,
many more millions.
what we
of
just
people
went through just not too long ago.
Yeah, let me note that I worked in the White House. God blessed me with the opportunity of working for Ronald Reagan as one of his speechwriters for 7 years. And I remember when Ronald Reagan declared that the Soviet Union was the focus of evil in the modern era. And let me say, Mr. Chairman, that I think that we need to make sure that we declare that this Islamic terrorist threat of killing people for their faith is now the focus of evil in our era. And call upon all good people of every faith to step forward and say this will not be tolerated by civilization. Just as communism, which was trying to use terror and brutality and the same kind of Stalinist obliteration of people's lives in order to terrorize the population into an atheistic dictatorship. We defeated that evil, and we must defeat this evil as well. And it doesn't just mean, and as we all know, Ronald Reagan did not declare war on Russia and send our military to attack Russia.
Mm-hmm.
We did not do that. Everybody assumed that that's what would happen. Ronald Reagan, that's how we'll defeat the Soviet Union. That's not what we did. Ronald Reagan mobilized the people of the world and especially reached out to those people who were struggling against communism and worked with them and helped them not just provide safe haven, but the means to help secure themselves from that evil at that day. We need to do that here. But let me note, just like Ronald Reagan was really criticized for calling the Soviet Union the evil empire, and I can remember very clearly, oh my God, what did you speechwriters give him? What's going on there, you know? And actually Reagan was very much part of the whole effort, and
He was
and
right.
he knew what he was saying, and the bottom line is, by labeling this something that people could understand, and by mobilizing behind it, we were able to destroy the Soviet Union, which was an evil empire of atheist dictatorship. We were able to eliminate that without a war. And this president's inability to use the word Islamic terrorist in the same sentence, or to use the word Christian when we're talking about genocidal movements that are going on in this world today, does not give me faith that we're going to solve this problem. So it's up to us, by the way, us, United States, U.S. is us, and we need and what we represent. What does the United States represent? Hopefully we represent every race, religion, and ethnic group in the world standing together for higher values than those values they had when they left their homeland. So thank you all for being with us today. Thank you, Chris Smith, for your wonderful leadership on this issue. And let me just remind everybody, I have H.R. 4017, and I would hope that all religious groups get behind this. It says basically that if in those areas where we have this genocide taking place, that those people who are targeted for genocide, particularly the Christians and the Yazidis, that they will be given a priority status for immigration and for refugee status by our government. And I do not believe that this is discriminatory against anyone. It's simply recognizing that they are the most in danger, and those are the ones we should focus on first. And just as when the Jews came here in 1939 and we turned them away, we should not have turned them away saying, you're not going to get any special favors from us. No, that was horrible, and we know what happened. Well, now we need to pay particular attention to those in danger and to focus on helping them. Anybody who can support my legislation, I'll be very happy to have that too. Thank you.
Chairman Rohrbacher, thank you very much, and thank you for your leadership. And added to that, Jackson Vanik, most favored nation status vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, was predicated on singling out Jewish refuseniks, those men and women who were denied and treated harshly by the Soviet regime. So it's not a religious test. That's absurd talk. Ms. Bass.
I wanted to know if you could talk about the refugees that have gone to Europe and what their status is. I've been very concerned about that, knowing that some have been returned back, but I wanted to know if you could speak about that. And then also, the ones that are wanting to come to the United States, where are they now? Are they in Germany? Are they in Greece? Where are they now? And what is their plight. And I, to anyone.
Well, our Yazidi refugees are mostly in Turkey and Syria. They are United Nations refugees. But also, most of the abducted ones are in Iraq, and we hope that U.S. could do something to help those innocent. U.S. has more than like 3 million plus people. I think they are able to provide help and support to those innocent people, both Yazidi, Christian, and other minorities who are facing the genocide, actually.
How many people did you say it is?
We have about, the Yazidi have about more than like 30,000 in Syria and Turkey. But in northern Iraq, there are many who could not be able to bring their identity, like passport or other documents, when they were attacked, because they were attacked in the middle of the night and just they were running for their lives.
How are they faring in Turkey? And
Not good.
are they in refugee
June,
camps?
in June, thousands of them tried to cross Bulgarian border on foot. Many of them were returned, were beaten by Turkish government, and were returned to camp. But when they came to close to camp, they did not let them in camp. They stayed more than 2 weeks outside. They were sleeping outside in the streets. So the Yazidis had nothing to bring with them.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have nothing, so you are only relying on the donation that the world, like international community, is providing. And the other problem, when it goes to Iraqi government or Kurdi government, unfortunately, that aid does not reach the needy people.
Mm-hmm.
And we cannot say that in Iraq. If you say it, your family is gonna face severe consequences by the authority based there. Many of those abducted women and girls I spoke to, they were afraid to tell me the truth.
They what, I'm sorry?
They were afraid to tell the truth.
Right.
When they came, they were told what to say and how to say. And also, because they saw like people from different groups who joined up with ISIS, who raped them, who tortured them, who kidnapped them, who sold them into sexual slavery. They were, many of them, they were their neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
They were beheaded and put in a bakery oven by their neighbors. So it's a very difficult situation.
So
When that delegation visit Iraq, mostly it's accompanied by the authority. They provide like what they call security for them. So when there are 4 or 5 armed men behind you, and then you ask me a question on how you want me to answer your
Right.
question, while I cannot not speak anything.
So what is your thought about what the U.S. should do? Should the U.S. bring over, I mean, how many, and do you have?
Well, whatever the possibility, we hope that you can bring, especially, as I said, those abducted women who were able to escape on their own and with their families, to provide social psycho help so that they can go back to their normal life.
Do you have relationships here, like with religious organizations or particular states that would receive the people? Where would they go?
Well, the Yazidis are very easy, like in integration, and I think Bishop knows, like we have been together for thousands of years as like brothers and sisters. The Yazidis are not against any people. Just say we are human beings, we are human beings. God created us, and we should respect God's work. So
Yeah, I just wondered if there were organizations
Yeah,
here you
yeah.
were affiliated with, that if we were able to bring
but
people.
we have at least about probably 350 to 400 Yazidi families here. They are all willing to help them.
Where are they?
They are
Everywhere?
in Nebraska, in New York, in Houston, Texas, in some are based in DC area.
And they've been here for a while,
Yes.
and they would be willing to
And
receive
many of
people?
them were the victim of Saddam's attack during
I see.
1991.
Okay.
So they stayed in Syria in refugee camp probably for about, many of them more than 10 years, 8 years. And then
Okay.
we have many were sponsored by US government. So we hope that you could provide the same help and bringing those needy people.
Thank you. Mr. Gotzo?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to respond to your 2 questions. First, I had the opportunity to travel to Serbia last month and spent some time talking to the people who were traveling. Most had come from Turkey via Greece, Macedonia. We're heading to Serbia, passing through on their way to Croatia, and then further afield. The people I met were probably some of the nicest, friendliest people I've ever met in the many years I've been involved in humanitarian work. And none of them that I spoke to had any interest in going to the U.S. They were looking to go to Austria, Germany, Sweden, and Belgium. UNHCR actually came out with an interesting study today or yesterday, I believe, that highlights the percentage, the very large percentage of those who are moving through Europe who are actually students. And a lot of the people that I met were looking to continue their education. I met people who were marketing majors at university in Damascus, people who just wanted to find some way of resuming their studies and resuming a normal life as best they could. On the question about the people who do want to come to the U.S., I think it's really important to highlight that the vast majority of the 4.2 million refugees from Syria who are being hosted in the region are actually staying outside of camps. Those people who are registered with the UNHCR are eligible for resettlement. They're able to go through that process, irrespective of being in the camp or not. One of the things that we're advocating for is for more opportunities for livelihoods for those people to be opened up in the countries where they are. We've seen that there's an average of the average refugee crisis now lasts about 10 years, and it seems that Syria will be likely to certainly not be an exception, and perhaps stretch that amount even longer. It's really important that aid gets to people where they are, and not just focusing on the camps, and that people can be able to work for themselves, to provide for their own families, and really have that dignity that work comes in being able to take care of yourself. The process of resettlement, as I said, is available to people who are outside of the camps. Most of them, though, are in Jordan and Turkey. There's not a processing facility, as far as I know, as the last I checked, available in Erbil for the U.S. to process people there. And there's been really a lot of delays due to space in the embassy in Beirut for there to be interviews conducted in Lebanon. So we're seeing the majority of people who are being processed happening in Jordan and Turkey. It's worth, again, noting that the process is incredibly extensive. It takes usually 2 to 3 years. We unfortunately just heard the really tragic news that one of the families that we were working with who were undergoing this process, they're a family of 7 from Syria. They're living in northern Jordan. They have 5 children, 3 of whom have very serious medical conditions. And we just received the word that the youngest of their children, a 1-year-old boy who really required open heart surgery, died just a few days ago. They've already gone through 2 interviews at the embassy. They're in this very
Why
extensive...
did he die? Did he not get the medical treatment, or he died in the process of receiving the treatment?
He wasn't able to have the surgery that he needed, and their hopes were really pinned on coming to the U.S. They'd been through, I don't know how many months of screening process, 2 interviews, which of course requires...
In a situation like that, where there's a life-threatening disease, we don't expedite?
I don't think there are that many opportunities. Certainly on the security side, those processes do take a long time. And I think this is one of the reasons that our response to some calls for a pause to the resettlement process,
Right.
to observe it, we wanted to really educate people, and particularly members of Congress, that the dangers that kind of pause could bring. It sounds very reasonable and something that might give us an opportunity to reassess. But the way the system works is that people who are in the midst of the process, who have various processes, steps, have checks and screening processes, those checks will expire, and they'll have to start again from scratch. And people like that family would have to restart if we were to pause that process. So what we're trying to emphasize
Oh,
is,
wait a minute. If we were to pause the process, then they would have to go back.
in all likelihood, yeah.
If I may also continue what Mr. Gazchak was saying, that in Turkey, I was there in April and was able to celebrate Easter with many of the refugees in a minimum of 10 to 12 different regions in Turkey. When you register with the United Nations as a refugee, your first interview is in 2022. That's
Excuse me?
interview. That's not...
You registered today?
If you register today, actually, those who registered had already been registered in April of this year. Their first appointment is in 2022, 2023. I do know of refugees that have been there for 7, 8, 9 years. I do know that also the Homeland Security have gotten cases where everything is ready, everything is done, and in many cases, and we have proof and we have the files where it's been 9 years, 10 years, 11 years,
So you've
13
seen,
years.
you've seen what, legislation we've been discussing and passing over the last few days?
Well, I have not seen their legislation. No, I'm a little behind that, to be honest. But I can
But
say,
we're making it slower.
well,
I mean, what did
yeah.
we do yesterday?
I think we froze it for a while.
Oh, visa waiver.
Yeah.
But
Well,
A couple of weeks ago, or was it a week ago, that we slowed it up?
The case with Homeland Security, these are cases that are already done that just need to do, I mean, there has been no response. If it's denied, it's denied. If it's not even a denial, it's cases that are lost in some cases and some issues. And to be able to deal with people and countries that are hosting them, such as Jordan and Lebanon, they're overwhelmed.
Oh, I
Turkey
know.
as well.
I know, especially
And-
Jordan, too.
Right, so processing centers are extremely important to have.
So,
Working with the United Nations, trying to get processing centers, and also allowing different countries who have vowed to say, you know what, we will take an X amount of refugees from these particular situations. And if they're not processed, then there's nothing that can be done.
so, Mr. Ismail, you're proposing that we kind of fast forward all that, right? I mean, the 30,000 people you're talking about.
Yeah, we're not telling that the U.S.
Oh, I'm sorry, did you want to?
No, I'm good.
Oh, okay.
But U.S. could help them. There are many of those families, they have lost more than half of the family members, and they say there's no way that they can go back to Iraq. Because
Yeah, but given this process, I guess I'm asking,
it's same thing, what they provide with the UNHCR paper, same thing, and I have many of those files in my mobile. They give them like 7 years, 8 years, and also we have some like, just they came recently were sponsored like by a private group. There are other people, they have interview, in less than 6 months, they get refugee status.
Mhm.
So there's something going on, it's not right. They don't give equal treatment. And I have many of those, like especially I am dealing with all the kind of ESD cases. I don't know how many files I have in Canada. They give them like, probably the soonest one, they give like more than 5 years.
okay,
So until 5 years, how they're gonna survive, they would not.
right. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bass. Let me just ask a question about disproportionality of those who are Christian who come here. Over the last 5 years, the estimates are that there's been 1 Yazidi, 53 Syrian Christians, and that 2.6% of the 2,003 Syrian refugees that have come to the United States are Christian. From Syria, so disproportionate to the need. Mr. Anderson, you spoke very eloquently to the issue of how there's a discrimination that happens starting in the camps, or at least those under protection of the UNHCR. That seems to be an area ripe for reform. I mean, 1 Yazidi, 53 Syrian Christians in 5 years. I mean, that's outrageous, I believe. And very few Druze, Baha'i, or Zoroastrians as well, like 10 total. Maybe, Mr. Anderson, you might want to expound upon a little bit on what needs to be done on the refugee side. And secondly, in the letter that was signed by you and many other people of faith, leaders, where there's a call for a limited review, when you exclude or narrow what it is that you're looking at so unnecessarily, which I think has happened or is happening at state, it's like a fireman, entering just one room in a burning building and concluding that one room of that building is on fire, while the whole building is ablaze. So my question would be, why the limited review? I mean, again, going back to Dr. Stanton, who just showed the connectivity over the years to this false reliance on terms like ethnic cleansing, which have no legal definition, and it was used extensively at the UN and here during Bosnia as well as in Croatia. And so if you could, what can we do to get it right immediately so that these refugees, and in follow-up to Ms. Bass, you know, there has been a vote on pausing, but it's not law. Nothing precludes, you know, the person who was so sick getting that help right now from this administration, and why haven't they? I mean, that's what my colleagues and I often do with casework. We try to find someone who is really, really being hurt, whether it's, you know, a health issue or whatever, and trying to find a way through the bureaucracy to mitigate that pain. So, Mr. Anderson, did you want to touch on that and any others? Because we're going to have to conclude in a minute because there are 5 votes on the floor.
Well, then let me just say quickly, I think that it's very clear that the religious minorities are not welcome, do not feel safe in the camps. And therefore, if the process hinges on being in the camps, we have to find alternative mechanisms to go out and register these people outside of the camps. And so that requires an extra effort. And I think that's why the designation of genocide is so important, because it gives priority to these vulnerable minorities, which, as Mr. Ishmael said, cannot go back to their communities. Their homes are destroyed or occupied by other individuals. They have no opportunity. We're talking about 5, 10 years to get a visa and immigrate to another country. It may be that amount of time before they can go back. They could go back to their own communities, but by that time, what are those communities going to look like? They're going to be totally populated by people who are not just going to move away and say, come back to your homes that you left 10 years ago or 5 years ago. So I think the designation of genocide is essential to prioritize these minority communities that have no alternative in the region.
Thank you. Anybody? Yes, Dr. Stan.
Just to reiterate that our conclusion as genocide scholars is that when lesser terms, weaker terms are used, it is a sure indicator of an unwillingness to act. In other words, it's a sure indicator of lack of political will. And in this case, what we've got is a lack of political will to accept Christians as on a preferential basis as the refugees that we will accept in this country. I think there's a general view that there should be no preferences at all. In fact, I think President Obama has said such, almost exactly that. And our view is that, in fact, certain groups are being targeted. And let's call what that means. Let's call out the right name, and that's called genocide. And that's why we think what's going on when they're making these selective determinations is an expression of lack of political will.
Yes, Mr. Gottschalk.
If I could just add, Mr. Chairman, in response to your point about, and Mr. Anderson's point about expanding the referral process, I think that's something we'd absolutely agree with, and just want to let you know there is in fact precedent for that. I believe at present there's one NGO that's been authorized to conduct referrals to the U.S. for resettlement. There's I think it's a short curriculum that NGOs would have to go through in order to, or any contractor would have to go through to be able to learn what criteria the U.S. is looking for. And it's something that we would very much like to see. It would be really a way of expanding the reach of resettlement referrals across the region. And just finally to add, the funding shortages that you made the subject of this hearing, and that I testified about and others have mentioned, has directly resulted in many refugee families really falling through the cracks because these appeals are so underfunded. 40% inside Syria, about 50% in the regional response. The prioritization is given to life-saving services, which means that social services and the types of activities that are really about protection and making sure that communities and refugees who are living in host communities where the majority are can be safe and can resolve some of their own challenges. Those type of programs just aren't being funded. The very types of programs that would identify vulnerable people, get them to where they could get referred for resettlement or for treatment or whatever they might need in the host community, if that was in fact the case. But those very programs are the ones that are really first on the chopping block when it comes to funding shortages.
Well, thank you. And that was an eye-opener for many of us at the hearing I chaired in September, just how underfunded it is. So your point is very well taken. And we are pushing the administration to do more, and our allies too. We've asked them to give us the list of those who have not come forward with the pledges at least, and what diplomatic efforts are being done by the administration to say to Saudi Arabia. I asked the Saudi ambassador when he was here in this room, or 2200 a week ago, he was claiming that they were giving 2.5 million Syrians refuge, and that they had spent $1 billion last year, including money for the people from, I think $1 billion was the total. It was approximately $1 billion. So your point's well taken, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. We got to push, and I even said, even if it's seen as a bridge, we try to get the others to come up with the money, but this is a short-term tourniquet that's needed because people, and he himself, Pitterman said, Shelley Pitterman, that the trigger for the mass exodus to Europe was undoubtedly the funding shortfall for humanitarianism, exacerbated by the World Food Program's 30% cut. They said, they don't care, we're off, we're leaving. And it was a point well taken. And we had PRM's assistant secretary here and asked what could be done. We're still trying to work with them. So I agree wholeheartedly on that.
If you wouldn't mind,
Yes.
if, as you wait for the list from the U.S., from the administration, Oxfam actually has a list of major countries and what they've donated according to their fair share. According to our statistics, Saudi Arabia has only contributed 6% of their fair share this year.
6%.
Qatar, 17%. United Arab Emirates, 38%.
Wish I had that last week, but I will follow up.
I'll
Please,
pass it along to your office.
Let's make it a part of the record if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments before we conclude? There is a vote, and I'm going to have to run. I do thank you so very much. I think the president got it wrong when he said that we don't want a religion test. This has to do with who's being targeted. It's a whole different issue than a religious test. And I again underscore my first trip on human rights issues was to Moscow and Leningrad, 1982, during my first term, on behalf of Soviet Jews. And I was very happy that our country was wholeheartedly using its policies, Jackson Vanik in particular, to protect Jewish people who were being put into psychiatric prisons or worse, killed. Yes, Mr. Ishmael.
For two important points, we hope that for the short-term solution, you can bring as many as possible of those needy refugees, especially those traumatized ones, whether they're in Syria, in northern Iraq, in Jordan, in Turkey. And for long-term solution, we hope that you could work with the Iraqi government and the KRG government to create a safe haven for the Yazidi,
Right, you had that in as your
and
number
other
3 point. I
minorities,
saw that.
so that these people can survive on an ancient homeland that we have survived for thousands of years. Yes, there are many people because of fear, they want to get out, but there are also thousands of people, they say we are ready to die, but we are not ready to leave our homeland.
If
So
that's done, it has to be better than what we've done before when Srebrenica and other safe haven areas were designated. They became mustering areas
now
for
most of the
killing.
Yazidis, if you ask, they're going to tell you this is the end of the Yazidis in Middle East, because no action has been taken actually to save them, to provide safe and security for them yet. Thank you.
The hearing is adjourned, and I thank you also very much.
Thank you.